Okay, hello everyone. I'm going to just start this off with a little housekeeping if you don't mind. Um, we have, because of our expectations for a large number of people today, we've tried to mute everyone and turn everyone's video off. That's going to enable you to to hear better and to see better this entire presentation. You can always comment in the chat. If you're not familiar with Zoom, and I don't know who isn't these days, but if you're not, all you need to do is hover on your screen, and at the bottom you'll see the word chat. Click on that, and you will be able to write your comments, write your questions, and you can do that as you think of them, and we are going to take some time at the end and answer as many as we have time for. There's also going to be a survey link, so you'll be able to make comments, give us feedback, and it's really important to us that you do. So please stay tuned for that. We'll post it in other places as well. I just want to point out that there's a way to reduce the real estate of the speakers' faces on the presentation slide. If you hover over it, look at participants, there's a little box at the top right. There are a couple of options. Play with them to see what suits you best. I like the little one that minimizes the faces, and then you'll be able to see the entire screen during the presentations. We are recording this presentation. It will be available on our YouTube channel, and we'll link it on our website as well. So I think our housekeeping is done, and I'm going to turn it over to our presenters.
Hi, everyone. Just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us for this community meeting for the Huntington Park design. We are just going to give you a brief overview of our agenda. We'll also get into the team introduction shortly as well. But first, just wanted to run through. So we are going to have kind of a more elaborate introduction by Tina WINSTEAD, and she's going to talk a little bit about the library history and the legacy going into the 100th year anniversary. And then we will go into our team introduction from the Stimson design team. We will try to keep both of those to about 5 minutes or so, and then moving forward beyond that, we will be talking about a brief history of Huntington Park and the library and Henry Huntington himself, and how some of that information has informed some of the design decisions that we've been starting to put forth. We will then also go into a little bit of an understanding of the regional context. One of our design team members, whom you'll meet shortly, grew up around Oneonta, so he's very familiar with the place, and his experiences and the experiences that we'd love to hear from all of you all certainly help to inform our design thinking as well. So we'll get into some of that regional context, and then we will kind of dig into the design there for about 20 minutes and go through some of the phase 1 ideas that we're putting forth. And then beyond that, we are going to open up the Q&A, and we will also give a brief explanation about the survey that we would love for you all to participate in. So we'll walk through some of that, and we will try to leave time at the end for some questions. And as Tina mentioned too, there's at any time during the presentation, you can add comments in the chat bar, and then I will try to respond. I'll be fielding the chat bar, so I'll try to answer questions during the presentation, or I will save the questions for the end of the presentation, and we'll try to address them at that time with the group. So yeah, any comments you have, just send them in the chat bar, and or save them for the end, and we'll try to get to them. And we are looking forward to sharing this with you all. So thank you.
Well, I want to welcome everyone to this very bright spot in the middle of a very difficult era in our community and in our world. You probably realize that all of us are struggling to manage work, our personal lives, and that's why I want to take a special moment to commend the Stimson team for delivering a very inspired park design during this COVID era. It's one that I believe Henry Huntington would be most proud. 100 years ago, Henry Huntington left his old home and this park to the city to be used as a library. And he asked that it be called the Huntington Park and Library. Libraries are chartered with New York State, and the Department of Education didn't really approve that title. And so they all compromised, and then we became the Huntington Memorial Library. The library board and the director manages the facility, both the building and the grounds. And that's been going on for decades. I don't know if it's a 100-year-old practice, but for many decades. You probably know that we've been working on the park for years. It's been a very slow process, but very exciting. We started 3 or 4 years ago to develop a conceptual design, and we brought that design to the community and many community groups online. We had a big reception. We had surveys online and print, and we just did everything we could because we really wanted to hear back from the community. So we ended up with a nice plan, nice feedback, and we started looking for funding. And that was a very slow process, but feel very fortunate that we got some significant funding from the New York Parks and Rec, and also from New York State Library Construction Aid, which is going to pay for the beautiful historic lampposts in the park. We then launched a request for proposal process to find the best candidate to bring our ideas to reality. The Stimson landscape architects were selected based on their wonderful design aesthetic and their comprehensive approach to the park. And you'll have an opportunity to speak with each of the team members through the night, so you'll get to appreciate them as much as I do. Early in this process, we were supposed to meet for a site visit in March, which, as you know, we couldn't do. So they asked me to send images from our archives of the early days of the park. And so I just laid them out on my table and took snaps with my phone. And I found a 1919 blueprint of the park. It's really very difficult to see. It's not in great shape. And I found another beautiful, I loved this one survey. It was in a 1965 box, but it was actually, Glenn Valentine noticed it was a 1933 plan. And what I thought was really an exercise in them being thorough turned into an especially conscientious foundation for the design you're gonna see tonight. And without giving anything away, I wanna say how very right it feels to bring back elements of the park that were originally part of Henry Huntington's vision. I think the Stimson team has managed to honor the traditions and the history of Oneonta while expanding their vision into a beautiful, comprehensive design that is above and beyond what we started with. So settle back and enjoy the presentation.
Okay, so I'm Glenn Valentine. Thanks for that wonderful introduction, Tina. That was great. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the firm. We're a landscape architecture firm of 30 people, centered in Boston and Cambridge, actually. And we also have an office out in Princeton, Mass. And this image you see at the top of the screen is Steve and Lauren's farm. The firm has been in practice for 25 years. And here you see the whole firm. We're about 30 people gathered at what has become a tradition, our annual Harvest Festival dinner, which we have at the farm. And this has become kind of the roots of our design firm, where we learn some really key aesthetics and dig into some of the design concepts of the region and of the agrarian history of this part of the country. Our design practice spreads across the whole country, but it really focuses in New England and upstate New York, and we're quite proud of that. One thing which sets us apart, I think, from most other firms is not far from the farm that you see in this photograph, we have a nursery where we grow our own trees, and everyone in the firm participates in the process of both digging the trees and maintaining the trees and transplanting the trees. So you really learn a lot hands-on with this farm and with the nursery close by. I'm a principal in the firm. I've been working with Steve and Lauren and the whole team for almost 15 years, and I have 25 years of experience working on parks and gardens and college campuses all across the country. And now the other members of the team are going to take a moment to introduce themselves.
So hi again, everyone. So I'm Laura Gomez. I am a senior associate at Stimson and the project manager, kind of co-project manager for the project with my other team members. I have been at Stimson for about 7 years now, and during that time, I've also worked on a number of campus projects, some residential, and some park projects as well. And I, particularly love park design and all that that can bring to the community. So I'm really excited to be here with you all tonight, and we're really excited to hear any input that you have to share with us. So yeah, great to be here. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Sean Klein. I'm an associate at Stimson. I actually grew up over in Delhi and moved out to Boston for school about 2011, and I've been working for Stimson for the last 4 years now. And I think that my upbringing in an agrarian kind of setting like Delhi and like Delaware County was really something that drew me to Stimson. And something that I've been able to appreciate in all the projects that I've worked on, from institutional to public to residential, even some farms in there as well. And this has been an incredible opportunity for me to work on a project that's so close to home and is so personal to me. So very excited to share with you what we've put together so far. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Ben Turpin. I'm a landscape designer and planner at Stimson. I've been at Stimson for about a year now. I moved up to Boston for grad school in planning, and then ended up staying once I got a job here at Stimson. Before that, I spent about 3 years practicing landscape architecture in Richmond, Virginia, working largely on public parks, greenways, and institutional projects. And prior to that, I worked as a landscape architect with the National Park Service in Yosemite National Park. So in my short time here at Stimson, about a year, this has definitely been the highlight of my time. It's been a great project, and had a great visit out to the park and met with Tina there about a month ago. So really excited to be working on this, and we're looking forward to sharing this with you. Thanks. So I'm going to start off here talking about the history of Huntington Park and Henry Huntington. This first map is an 1884 bird's eye image of Oneonta. Highlighted in red there is the location of the park and the library today. But something to note in this image here is really how different everything looks in kind of the hinterlands of Oneonta. At that point in time, into the mountains that you see ridges and hills around the town. This is a zoom in to where the park and library are. This was in that 1884 image as well. So at this point, it was still the Huntington estate. You can note the orchard there on the hillside. That was something that we discovered within our deep dive into the history. So that's an element that kind of makes a comeback within our design. Another thing that's very interesting here is the livery that was once on the lower part of the site. So in our research, we discovered a number of elements that are no longer visible. This was definitely one of the most interesting ones. Another discovery was when we dove into the 1886 Sanborn map. This was published 2 years after the previous image we just looked at. So Sanborn was an insurance mapping company that primarily focused in urban areas and would map buildings and their typologies for the purpose of fire insurance. So when we discovered this, we saw in this upper section the Metropolitan Theater, which at one point was one of the larger theaters within Oneonta. They had a number of performances that would come through the town, and it was really a focal point until a different theater moved in, and ultimately this one closed in the late 1880s. Down below is the livery that we noted in the previous image, also no longer on site. But an interesting thing that really kind of came to light as we developed the plan further was that this theater is actually in the same place that we were discussing a performance venue, an outdoor performance gathering space. So kind of interesting how the old is influencing the new within the design process. I mentioned before as well that there were orchards on the site once, sort of on the northwestern corner of the site. So there are quite a few apple trees scattered around, and this photo on the lower left shows Henry Huntington and his family gathered under one of the more mature trees on the site. So to give you a little more info on Henry Huntington, he was founded his company in the realm of railroads and really made his fortune out in California, where he founded the Huntington Library and Botanical Gardens, which is 120 acres in Southern California. So within that museum and Botanical Garden, they have a number of rare maps, manuscripts, and a really vast collection of plants from all over the world. He also did a lot within philanthropy, and was in that light that he decided to give his parents' estate in Oneonta to the town, as Tina had discussed earlier. So given his interest in horticulture and design, he was a very key element of the design process of Huntington Park after he had gifted over the property. He hired James Greenleaf, who was a very notable landscape architect at that time, and the landscape architects behind the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., to develop the plan into Huntington Park, as we can still see elements of today. So Huntington was very involved in laying out the path system and picking some of the plants that were found in the trees within the park. So more so than most benefactors, he was very intimately involved in the design process. So the next few images are some collections of postcards that we discovered. Called in the upper right here. This was a prominent point that would look down out over downtown Oneonta, where you could have gatherings and really take in the view out towards the town. There are also a lot of evergreens and other trees planted along this steep hillside that runs through the park. This is a photo looking at approximately that same vantage point. But as often happens when you plant evergreens, they grow quite large. So in this image, you can no longer see the rotunda, but the evergreen trees and other vegetation really grew in quite thickly over the following years. Ultimately, in 1966, the rotunda was removed. It was kind of falling into disrepair, and in a plan the entry to the library. So compared to many other elements, this is probably the most familiar looking today. With the exception of the addition, much of this front of the library really looks quite similar. Then in 2017 and 18, as Tina mentioned, Templeton Landscape Architects took on a program study and had a pretty in-depth process with community members and folks at the library. So they really came up with a great plan with a lot of good concepts that we are now building upon as we take what was ultimately kind of a programmatic and conceptual study and work towards more implementable projects. So we will take you through some of those designs and ideas now. And Sean will first talk about the context. Sorry about that.
Great. No worries. Thanks, Ben. That's thanks for the historic introduction. And yeah, again, it's been really exciting for me personally to learn about all the history of the site and something so close to home. Now, before we start to look at and imagine the future design of any public space, any public park, we like to take a step back and look at it in its context, in its current context, both urban and natural, and see how that space is going to interact with those components, all the surrounding components. So this first diagram here is an aerial image of Oneonta, of course, with Huntington Park there highlighted at the center, looking at the space of the park within the context of the Oneonta Park system. So you can see kind of at the edges of this, the urban fabric, kind of that residential and yeah, exactly as Ben's highlighting there. Some of the larger parks at the periphery. So the Swart Wilcox Historic Park there at the south, and the Newa Park. They're kind of bridging that space between the interstate and the mill race and the rail. And we, based on the size and the location of those parks, they have quite similar programs or activities that actually happen there. Very highly active spaces, a lot of team sports facilities. Newa Park, for example, which is really the more accessible by foot from the downtown. You have the baseball fields, the old minor league ball field. It kind of has the energy of the interstate and of the Lettuce Highway and the fireworks of 4th of July and that sort of thing. And then to the north, Wilbur Park, although it's nestled towards nestled within a residential fabric and a bit more wooded and quiet and tranquil, it still has that scale that allows for the type of highly active recreational activities that you see in the other two parks there. This is the place when I was a kid that we would have giant capture the flag games when I was in summer camp, or then in high school. Our cross country meets were run through that park. So again, we kind of see this edge being the surroundings of Oneonta being a very active kind of destination parks that have the kind of expansive spaces for these active recreation activities. And then Huntington Park, much more modest in size, is really at the center of the city and of the community, and really holding that place is the downtown green. When we zoom into that space on the next slide here, we can really start to understand the fine-grained adjacencies, immediate adjacencies, and understand how those will start to affect the design moves and the aspirations that we're going to be making. So just to orient ourselves here, of course, Ben, if you can just highlight Main Street there along the southeast. So Main Street's very proximate to the park, of course. Chestnut and Dietz running up along the sides there, south and north respectively. And we see that the park is really occupying this space, creating both a bridge and a buffer between the back of Main Street and the front of the residential fabric between Dietz and Chestnut. And then if we go to the next slide, we can really start to look at some of the aspirations and guidelines that we would start to set up in thinking about these adjacencies and how we want to carry some of those adjacencies forward into the design. So again, the park is very proximate to Main Street and has some strong connections, some strong views from Dietz in Maine, from Chestnut in Maine. And my memory as a kid growing up here, to me that the park, we would come up to Wilbur Park and come to Newa Park and go to a ball game and come up to Main Street, but I don't think we ever frequently made it as far as going up to Huntington Park. And we would hope to, going forward in the design, we'd hope to really strengthen these views, maintain these views into the park, and start to animate the park to draw folks from Main Street with some of the programmatic elements that were identified in the previous program study. So there's, sorry, go back one more, then, sorry.
Sorry about that.
So, no worries. So highlighting these and strengthening the primary entrances on Dietz and Chestnut, and then strengthening even another opportunity for a secondary entrance on Wall Street there, as the park really now has more of a public front face to Main Street through the buildings that are there across the parking lot. And then coming up Dietz Street, there's a future mixed-use development plan there, artist lofts and some other uses. So that could start to animate the space directly across that performance space, of course. And then working our way around the north side, we realize there's some adjacent residential homes there that we need to be conscious of providing screening, but still allowing some visibility in for safety reasons. And then, of course, lastly, imagine coming down from the residential fabric of the neighborhood into the park. And everyone who's been to the park knows about the topographic change, that slope, and that prospect, that view that Ben mentioned in the historic analysis that looks out over the city and really out over the hills of Oneonta, right? It really is the city of the hills, and that is so evident when you're there in the town. You can really feel that, which we can actually see physically on the next slide here. So this is just a topographic map of Oneonta and of the surrounding area. And you can see these landforms, which are described by those contours on the north side, especially of the city there, that's highlighted in red. And the city is really nestled within those hills, right? And you can see them, you can really feel them when you're there in the town. One of my favorite spots to go to in Oneonta is actually right where it says Hartwick College on top of that knoll above Oneonta, exactly. Table Rock, which is on the next slide here. I think this is just a great context image of the city of the hills right within the hills. You get this amazing prospect over the city and see it within the context of the mountains and within the context of the materials of the region, right? The bluestone bedrock and the other types of bedrock that you have around upstate New York. I've found a lot of inspiration in these types of materials and really rooting a place within its geologic context, and that's something we really try to bring to a site wherever we're working on it, because it makes it feel local. It makes it feel really like it's rooted within its place. And these are the types of materials that, as a kid, when I was growing up in farm fields and in the woods here in the Catskills, these are the types of materials that I would encounter, and they're really, I think they're just embedded in everyone's memory who's familiar with that place. And if you've ever gone for a walk in the hills around Oneonta, you know about these. So we started to think about how we can start to integrate these materials into the design. And on the next few slides, you'll see some of the examples of the material that we've begun to find with some local suppliers that can start to help to shape and form the spaces and create some of the elements, be it whether they're seating elements, play elements, or just giving some spacious and definition within the park. And the other exciting thing about this is not just making the park feel rooted in its local context, but kind of speaking to the history of the place, the industrial history of the region, and the geologic history of the region with the bluestone, and then many other different layers of rock that are around the region, and using this as an educational tool for the community. And we've got a great local geologic expert has been helping us through some of that, some of the details on that. And with that, I will turn it over to Glenn to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the design development we've been doing on the park itself.
Okay, thanks, Sean. That was great. It's great to have someone so familiar with the area be part of the design team. He's been an invaluable resource as we've explored all these ideas for the park and how they apply to Oneonta. So we're going to show you a few images of some of the process diagrams that we went through to come up with some of our basic ideas, and then we're going to go into a little bit more detail, first showing you the overall master plan, and then zooming into a couple areas that we're seeing as kind of a phase 1 development for the park. So if you can, this is a sketch, and this is kind of typical of the kind of sketches that we do when we're working fast and we're trying to generate ideas for the park. Or any park or landscape that we're working on. We really look to the larger context, and this builds directly off the kind of images and plans that Sean was just showing you, with the fingers of the hills coming down from the north and pressing against the town of Oneonta between the Susquehanna River and those hills. And what we determined in examining this region was there really are some very distinct landscape types that we wanted to incorporate in the design of the park and really try and make this park emblematic of these landscapes. And you'll see here, very roughly here, you have kind of the Susquehanna River at the lowest level. With this, you see the trace of the river there and its floodplain with marshes, and particularly on the west, quite large marsh systems. It's really a distinctive part of the character of the region. And then just above that, out of the floodplain, where we have this kind of lighter green, which says community, that's where the town is. That's where Oneonta is, spreading out in this level valley floor that's elevated above the floodplain, but creating this area where community and commerce can happen. And then you have these wild hills, these fingers coming down from the north that have a very different character and rich native plant communities. We want to draw on that character as well. And kind of unique to Oneonta in a way, you have these, what we're calling terrace gardens. And really those are the locations for SUNY Oneonta and Hartwick College. These kind of, we see them as kind of hillside gardens overlooking the larger community. And we wanted to pull these distinctive landscape types into the park and make it kind of a microcosm of this larger region. And we'll show some of the ways we approach that. Next slide. This is another sketch we did during the design process, and these are both sections. And you can imagine these as kind of slices through the landscape. And this black line here is if you were to take a huge knife and cut through the region, these maps that we've been looking at of Oneonta, this is kind of what it would look like, with the forested hills at the top there up where Sean was talking about Table Rock, and you have that image of the whole region, and then going down this wild hillside, very steep in some areas, and then terraces where the colleges and universities are located, and then sliding down the hill down into this plateau in the river valley, which is set up above the river floodplain itself, then down to the Susquehanna River and the floodplain and the river itself. And directly below this is a section through the park. Again, imagine if you could slice through the park and look at it with the high part of the park on the left and the low part of the park on the right, down by Dietz Street on the right and Chestnut at the top. And we tried to draw parallels between the shape of the park and really the shape of the Oneonta region itself. So we started to imagine the upper area of the park being an arboretum, a place for horticultural collections, and really accentuating plants and sort of echoing that rich forested community that surrounds the valley of Oneonta. And then we have the rotunda historically kind of perched on the edge of that upper area. And to us, it kind of related to the way the universities, colleges and universities are perched over the town of Oneonta. And we thought, well, that's could relate in a way to a new rotunda or a new overlook space that may be in the park. And then you have the wild hillside, this very steep hillsides running down into the park. And we thought that was important. You have that kind of already in the park, and we wanted to really accentuate that and think of that as a place for play and exploration, places for sledding and slides, which we'll talk about some more, but really to keep that character, but make it a place that is someplace where kids could engage with the hillside and explore it. And then when you get to the bottom of the hill, this community flat or community green, we saw that as a logical place for the active activities of this park, picnicking and public gatherings and outdoor theater and a play landscape, which we'll describe. But to us, that's kind of a parallel to the town of Oneonta itself. This is where the community is, nestled down in the valley, wide and flat and very usable. And then as you continue, as in Oneonta itself, you get down to the Susquehanna River and the floodplain and all the water coming off the hills going into that river. We decided that it would be great to create a similar kind of condition on the eastern edge of this park, create a kind of wild edge that celebrates the river corridor, the grasses and the native trees of the Susquehanna River, and really make that a stormwater garden system that collects all the water from the rest of the park and gives it a chance to infiltrate before it goes into the streets and the rest of the paved conditions of the city. So those two images are kind of our inspiration. And now we'll go and show you a diagram of how these ideas kind of apply to the park. So here's a diagram of the overall character zones, we like to call them, of the park that I was describing. And if you can picture back that section through the parks, we're going to start up at the top of the hill by Church Street. And this is the area that I was just showing you in the images is the equivalent of the woodlands and the rich forested wood communities around Oneonta. So we saw that as a great place to have Pinetum, a collection of pine trees, which would be representative of the area, and all kinds of pine trees, really, to play up the kind of woodsy character. And also an area for orchards, which are harken back to the old history of this upper part of the site where Huntington had his original orchards on the estate, and some other elements which we'll get into. And then the wild hillside is a denser kind of growth of woods on that steepest part of the site, this dark green band running through the middle of the site. And that's, as I mentioned, where we could have a slide, and we'll show you some more details, or a sledding hill, and really create this place that's very different from the other areas and feels like kind of a wild woodland that you can explore. And then on the lower area of the park, you have the community green, which is this wide, flat area, which can take all kinds of programs, from events to a picnic grove to a green theater. All of these are program items that fit well into this large public active zone at the lower part of the park. And then continuing down, this is that section I was saying was kind of the equivalent of the river valley. And we didn't think of it as just one spot, but really the entire eastern edge of the park as a way to both define that edge of the park and gather all the water flowing down the hillside towards Main Street into a kind of continuous rain garden along that edge of the park. And then also reaching back up in this kind of finger of that river system, reaching back into the park to gather stormwater from all the upper parking lots and middle parking lots and paved areas of the park. And then finally, around the garden itself, we envisioned a series of individual garden spaces which could each be designed to a particular kind of program or teaching agenda which would complement the collections and the programs of the library. So with this in mind, we're going to take you to the master plan and talk you through some of that, where we are. So this is the master plan as it currently exists, and you can see there's quite a bit of detail drawn in here and a lot of labels. And I'm not going to go through everything on this plan because you guys will get a chance to get this presentation and go through it at your leisure after we're done with this meeting. But I'm going to talk you through some of the main elements in the different parts, just so you can start to see the forms that they're taking on in this master plan. First of all, we haven't talked about materials at all, but I want to harken back to what Sean was saying about the bluestone and talk about one of two axes or major spines in the park. And the first one is this kind of stone axis, which starts here in the south at the library itself. And we envision this being an axis of bluestone, which runs all the way through the park from the north to the south and helps to tie it together with this one material, which is so emblematic of the region. We see in the library gardens area, this could be bluestone walls or bluestone seats or benches. And then as you extend further to the north in the park, we see big bluestone blocks, which could be embedded into the hillside and be an inviting area for climbing and exploration. And then continuing on, become part of the more elaborate or specific kind of play landscape to the north. And then even up at the top of the hill, we envision the overlook being a series of walls made out of bluestone. So that's one of the elements that really, this kind of stone spine or axis that runs north to south, which helps to tie all the areas of the park together. The other one we're calling the water axis, and that really runs here from Wall Street down up to Church Street. And that's the stormwater system that I was telling you about, which would be a collection of grasses and native plants and shrubs and trees, which would be that you would find in the river valley, and would collect water from these paved areas, both the upper parking lot and the parking lot around the library, and channel them down through the site till they can get to the lower area where they could be infiltrated into a stormwater garden down at the bottom edge and all along that edge of the park. So those two spines are important, and those two ideas of materials uniting and tying the whole park together. Now I'll tell you, I'm going to start at the top and just tell you a couple of the items, key program elements in the park. Then I'm going to zoom into a couple areas with more detail. First, in the upper area of the park, I mentioned that we could have a pinetum. And we envision that being along this northern edge, these green circles being a collection of pine trees, native pine trees and collected pine trees, which would really create an edge to the park, some privacy between the upper area of the park and the residences to the north, but also a really wonderful experience for people walking along and learning about different kinds of conifers and pine trees. And then along the southern edge of that upper plateau, we envision this orchard. These small pink dots represent flowering trees and fruit trees. They could be apple trees, pear trees, peach trees, a whole collection of orchard trees, which the community can help to maintain and harvest, we even imagine. So we're excited about that idea. Then moving to the edge, you get to the overlook, which we've mentioned, which is really harkening back to Henry Huntington's original rotunda. It's on almost the same place. But here we're using these bluestone benches to draw people to the edge and create this kind of community terrace where you could overlook the rest of the park down below, but also the wider Oneonta community and stream valley and river valley. And then continuing down, you have this play landscape on the lower part of right below the overlook, where we have this very natural kind of play environment, which I'll describe in more detail. And here's where we're talking about the slide in the park. It'd be a large slide, which could be, we're estimating maybe 20 feet high and maybe 40 feet long. So we see that as a major component of the park. And then down in the lower area, we have the community green. And some of the components of that, as I mentioned, are outdoor theater. And we envision that being at this area of the park, which Ben is showing you in these green kind of curving forms, being evergreen hedges, which would form a back or backdrop to performances in that area. And then just adding some trees to this area just to enhance the wonderful oak trees that are down there now, and encourage that space to be used for community gatherings. And then to the southern part of that, a picnic grove where we would have picnic tables and benches and other items to draw workers during lunchtime or other times of the day to that part of the park. And then over by the library garden, I'll go into this in some detail, but you can see the series of walls and the continuation of that kind of bluestone matrix or system running into and helping to define that part of the park. Let's move on to the next slide where I'll start to get into a little bit more detail. Oh, one other item or system I wanted to talk to you about is most of the park we're dividing up into discrete areas and kind of zones of development. But some areas of the park we're looking at comprehensively right from the first moment I think of as an installation that would happen all at once. And as Tina mentioned, there's funding for lighting, new lighting throughout the park. This diagram, these orange dots, show the locations of the new lights that would be installed in the park. And we're working with engineers and lighting designers to make sure we have an even, consistent, and comfortable level of light throughout the entire park with these new light standards that are going to go in. And they're going to be the same lights that you see that are on Main Street down in this lower right image to strengthen that connection between the park and Main Street, and really to encourage as much of a flow of traffic and communication and identification between the park and the Main Street of Oneonta. Next. So as I mentioned, we're going to zoom in now to two areas of the park which we see as a kind of phase one construction, or the first areas that we're thinking of improving specific components of the park. We're going to look at the play landscape and overlook and the library gardens. Next. First, this is the play landscape, zooming in a bit to that area that I was describing before. And you can see in the lower right-hand corner here, this is a key map to show what part of the park we're looking at. That black circle there shows the area that's blown up in this more detailed plan of the park. And there's a few items or elements that come into play here which you couldn't see in the larger master plan. The first one being up at the top of the hill, we envision this whole area being sort of more contemplative and restful, and one of the key elements we see up there is a labyrinth, which could be nestled in this kind of part of the overlook of the park, and we see that as flat kind of paving stones set into a meadow landscape that would encourage contemplation and wandering through that labyrinth and meditative walking. Then adjacent to that, you start to see the overlook and some of the character of what that might look like. We envision that as kind of a paved terrace, and these darker bands here as bluestone seat walls, which are long and arcing and harken back to some of the forms of the overlook walls from the rotunda from Huntington's original plan. Right below that overlook, where we have hillside meadow, that's where we envision clearing out a lot of the plants that are there right now to restore a sledding hill. And during most of the year, it'd be a wildflower meadow. We have seasonal wildflowers both in the spring and in the fall. But in the winter, of course, we envision that being utilized for sledding. And then at the bottom, this green circular kind of space we're calling the dell, we envision a kind of bowl-shaped, shallow lawn place that could help to slow down those sledders coming down the hill and keep them contained before they get out into the walkway or the rest of the park. Continuing on up on this steep hillside, you see the slide. Show them that, Ben. So this is where the slide might go, and that, as I mentioned, this one's a little bit bigger than 40 feet. This is about 50 feet, but it will probably be about 40 feet long in the end, with a drop of about 24 feet. So we envision it as this large element, which would be quite unique to Huntington Park and draw people from all parts of the town and the area to really experience this interesting feature. So the way this would work, we have this slide coming down and be set right into the hillside, and then you have this rock scramble, we're calling it, to the right, where we envision kids climbing up, bluestone set into the hillside, kind of as a series of giant steps to get up to the top of the slide and then slide down and then race back and go up that scramble again to get to the top in a kind of loop. So we see that as both a fun slide and also an opportunity for kids to explore the hillside and really, that scramble is envisioned as a wide kind of series of rocks, not just a straight pathway, but would allow for exploration and kind of kids engaging with the hillside in many ways. Then down below that, we have the play landscape itself, which we envision for younger kids, and it's all set under the canopy of a tremendous northern red oak there, which would provide shade for that area and kind of create a contained area for the younger kids. Let's go to the next diagram then. Next one. This diagram shows some of the use and activity zones of this play landscape and overlook. Up above, you can see the kind of the path, an imaginary path one might take as walking through the labyrinth and just being nice and slow and contemplative. And then those arrows showing the vista. This is about where the old vista, the historic vista of the rotunda is. So we do a little bit of clearing there to create that same kind of overlook. And then that green zone there is the hillside meadow, which would be cleared of trees and really just be this flowering meadow that would take on the sledding function in the winter. And then the play landscape is really divided into two pieces. There's the blue section here and this purple section here. The blue section we envision being for older kids who might want to need more room for running and exploring. And we really want that to engage the hillside with bluestone blocks that would allow people to climb up into the lower parts of the hill with the scramble up to the hillside and the sled and the slide coming down the hillside there. And then the play landscape itself, that's this kind of purple egg-shaped form, really envision as a more contained zone for younger kids, where we might have all natural kind of play environments such as logs, stacked logs as a climbing element, or stumps for jumping from one stump to another, and we'll show you some images of that in just a moment. Next one. Here's some inspiration images that we drew from when we were thinking about this part of the park. And some of these images are parks that we've worked on and built before. But just to give you a better idea of what that slide might look like, this is a very large slide, but you can see the idea of that kind of scramble up the hillside, where the experience of climbing up the hillside to get to the top of the slide is almost as much fun as sliding down once you get to the top itself. So we're really excited about that as an element. This is probably a little bit bigger than the slide we're envisioning, but actually the slide we're envisioning is pretty good size. So we think it's going to be a really exciting element, and we're interested to get your feedback on that particular element at the end of this through the survey. Then you see some of these other images here. This is from Pulaski Park in Northampton in Massachusetts, the idea of these stumps that kids climb on and jump from one to the other. And down in the lower left-hand corner, the idea of this pile of logs for climbing, and using even the bluestone boulders as kind of play elements in the upper left-hand corner there. And that image in the center is what we envision for that labyrinth up on the top of the hill with stones set in a meadow landscape. So a very informal kind of character that almost accentuates the meadow and the surrounding grasses as much as the labyrinth itself. Then on the lower right-hand corner, this is the idea of this overlook. It'd be very simple. We might have more than one row of stones, but the idea is really just to get people to the edge and experience that wonderful vista over the town and over the river valley below. Next part of the design that we see as part of phase one are the library education gardens. And when you zoom in here, you begin to see that it's a series of gardens. It's not just one garden space, but we envision this as a series of outdoor rooms with very distinct plant collections that could serve unique educational functions in each one of these garden rooms. And there's one out on the gathering lawn by Chestnut Street, and then it wraps around to a literary garden, and I'll go through all of those in just a minute in a diagram. The other thing I wanted to point out on this plan is that we see the parking lot, the current parking lot, or this section of it, as a key part of the outdoor programming space as well. As a special events terrace, we can imagine it having some upgraded paving, just so it feels a little bit more like part of the library itself, like an outdoor classroom. And really we see that as a gateway or doorway that connects the library to the larger park landscape. Let's go to the next one here, Sean. Ben, thank you. So here's a diagram of these outdoor spaces and the idea that the garden spaces could have different teaching program elements. I'm just going to run you through these, and this is another one of those questions that we're asking on the survey. We're excited to get your feedback and your ideas on. But the way we're looking at it now, one of the key gardens, there's a series of these gardens, but for example, we could have out at the gathering lawn, right in front of the library on Chestnut Street, we could have a large pollinator garden, which would wrap around the front. And that would be planted with flowering plants that would attract bees and butterflies and hummingbirds and later goldfinches, just so people, students and kids could really enjoy that habitat that they create and learn about the cycle of the plants and how the dependence between pollinators and plants is really a key part of the environment. The next garden is this literary garden, which steps down the hillside and would incorporate the existing smoke bush by the library into that design. And we envision that as a garden that might be flexible and might change over time and would be suited to maybe a particular theme that the library might have for a year. It could be 1 year celebrate colonial plants, and the plants were used by colonists in early times of this country. And next year it could be a celebration of, say, World War II victory gardens, and there could be a theme teaching about that aspect of planting and how they're related to that time period. We also see areas, what we're calling here a reading nook, that green area, that are specially designed for just a bench and a librarian and a collection of, or group of kids to have a comfortable place to come out and read and relate what they're reading to the garden that they're in. Then continuing down to the east, we see some other garden opportunities. Here we're calling this a herb and medicinal garden, and that we see as an opportunity to show a permanent collection of plants that could explain how plants have been involved throughout history in science and medicine and continue to be a key part of science today. And continuing on further, we get more shade in this area of the park under some big trees, and we envision that as a native plants garden where you could bring the plants from the surrounding hillside down into this environment and really teach kids about native plants and the forest community. And then continuing up from that, back up towards the library, we'd have the first installation of a stormwater garden in the park, the first part of a larger system. But we see this particular piece of it as very important because it's directly related to the parking lot right next to the library. So it becomes a key element and tool for teaching kids and people, everyone going through the park, about the importance of collecting and gathering water from parking lots and other paved surfaces and roofs and treating and allowing that water to infiltrate before it runs further down the hill into the rest of the paved area of the city. So that's the kind of programming we're envisioning for those gardens. And here's some images of some of those, some inspirational images that helped direct us towards some of these designs. In the upper left corner is what we envision as the character of the reading nook, with these kind of comfortable benches and large perennial gardens and stone walls. This is from Radcliffe here in Cambridge. And down below it, we envision that part of this main walkway into the park and next to the library could have a collection of flowering shrubs, like the lilacs here at the Arnold Arboretum here in Cambridge. Or the stormwater garden, this one is from Pulaski Park, which we designed in Northampton, this kind of linear element through the park, but it can be a really rich and wonderful ecological garden in the middle of the park with all kinds of grasses and native flowering plants in them. And then just to the right of that is an image of the terrace, although trees may be part of the edge of that terrace to help define that parking lot and sort of transform it from a place where there are just cars to one where it's seen more as an outdoor gathering room for the library. And I think that wraps up the explanation of the design portion, and we look forward to your feedback in the survey that we're going to be giving you a link to in just a minute. And now Laura's going to take this on and talk a little bit about next steps in the design process.
Great, thanks, Glenn. So yeah, we just wanted to give you a sense of what our next steps are, moving forward from this evening, how we will be incorporating and thinking about, the feedback we receive from you all. You may have heard already, but if not, we will be opening up a survey to everyone, and we would love as much feedback as possible. Ben is going to go through shortly after I run through these steps. He's going to give a brief tutorial to kind of show a bit of the format of the survey and how to get going on that. And we are expecting 2 weeks time open that we have the survey open for. So there'll be time to take the survey and think about it after this presentation. You don't have to do it, right now. So there will be time to think it through. So, in 2 weeks' time, we are looking forward to everyone submitting the survey. And from there, we will be, combing through all of the information we receive, synthesizing the ideas, and we're also planning to compile everything and share the results with you all. And with all that great information, we will, take that back to the drawing board and further refine our designs that we presented to you tonight. Based on all of that feedback. And we then are anticipating another presentation with you all at a later date where we will share the revised designs for these phase one areas that Glenn has presented. So we will show you kind of, how we have taken them from, the state they're in this evening and taken them forward with your feedback. So we are, looking forward to that process, and we're looking forward to sharing updates with you in the near future. And I think if you flip, yep. So this pretty much sums up our presentation. So we just want to, thank you all. It's been great to be able to share all these ideas with you all, and we're super excited to hear from you. We want to take a moment here to do some Q&A. I think maybe Ben will, before we open up the Q&A, Ben can give you a quick run through of how the survey works. You'll see here we have a couple of links for how to access the survey, and we are planning on a survey deadline of 2 weeks from tonight, so Thursday, September 24th. And yeah, so I'll pass it over to Ben, and then we will try to have about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A time. I know we don't want to keep you all too late, but yeah, we would love to hear from you all. So yeah, so we'll open up the Q&A right after Ben gives the tutorial. Thanks, everyone.
I will pull that up right now. So we have a quick survey for everybody to fill out. Should only be about 5 to 10 minutes, but it covers a lot of the topics that we talked about here tonight. So we'll start with just some very general things about favorite memories or your perfect day at Huntington Park, just to kind of broadly understand sort of the feelings and emotions that go with Huntington Park. And then we'll get a little more specific, diving into the particular elements and zones that you are especially interested in tonight. So we'll ask you to choose your top 3 zones, top 3 activities you'd be most interested in doing at the park. There are also opportunities, if we didn't cover something, for you to write those in, so we know that those are things that you would like us to explore or address within the design. Then we'll get to a series of image rating, where a lot of these are images you've seen tonight, and some are new ones, but where we ask you from a 1-star rating, which is strongly dislike, up to 5 stars, which is love, to rate these images. And there's a little map on the side here that will show you the area of the park where these images are associated with. And with these images, it's important to note that these are more so inspirations, things we've pulled from other Stimson projects or from other parks that we find especially inspiring that we think could influence the design. So these are not necessarily things that will be exactly replicated at Huntington Park, but more so just an element that we're drawing inspiration from. So there's a series of these, I think about 10 different images or so, maybe 12. And then there are a few questions at the end that kind of wrap up the survey about the 2 particular zones that we went into greater detail with tonight. So we ask you about the gardens around the library, and then about the play area and the overlook. We'll also ask about what would make you feel more comfortable within the park, what issues you see within the park today, and then specifically about sledding and sliding, and then a broader question regarding any other comments, things we missed out on, things you'd like us to think about or address. So it should be a pretty quick survey, 5 or 10 minutes, and we would really appreciate feedback. We really think participation is a key element of the design process, so we are excited to hear your thoughts, and we look forward to reviewing those answers in a couple weeks and using that to influence our design as we move forward towards greater detail. So with that, I will pivot back over to Laura, and we will go into the Q&A.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. So yeah, we want to leave, at least 10 minutes. I'm going to put a timer on for 15 so we can kind of just keep track of time here. But I know we received a couple of questions throughout the presentation, which is great. Thanks everyone for your comments. It's been awesome. Really excited about all of this. And, I think we can start by, I know I addressed some of the questions during the presentation, but maybe I think one of the topics that would be great to elaborate on a little bit further is to just bring up the question about drainage and understanding. Mike had a question about how deep will the waterway drainage be, and will it be a shallow spillway or more like a ravine? And I think that it would be great for us to touch upon, what the character of these, swale spaces are like, just so everyone can understand it a little bit better. And then also, after that, we can keep going with more questions.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. It would not be a deep ravine at all. They would be quite shallow, and in fact, you've probably, a lot of people have seen rain gardens now. They become quite a common element around in parks and public landscapes. The stormwater gardens that we're envisioning would be maybe 18 inches deep at the most, and probably around 4 feet wide, or 3 to 4 feet wide, running through the entire park as kind of this dry riverbed, as you will, right along the edge of the main walkway through the park. And we think we always do this when we're designing stormwater elements. We try and lay them in parallel to the main circulation routes of the park, so that people are reminded of this process, that your experience in the park is always tied to the natural process of storm water flowing through this space, and you're tied to a larger system in the park. So there's going to be these shallow swale kind of next to the walk, but also planted with grasses and wildflowers. So it will have terrific horticultural interest throughout the year, and the grasses would persist into the winter, so they'd have a presence throughout the year. And then when you get down to the bottom of the hill, it'd be a wider, broader kind of stormwater garden there, which might get to 2 feet deep at its deepest point. But they're never going to have water in them for more than, say, 8 hours. The water would come in after a major storm and then would drain out by the end of the day or halfway through the day. So it's not like the kind of a pond or something that you would see in other landscapes. It usually would have very little water in it or no water in it, and it's only right after a storm event that you would have some water in the swale and in the basins at the bottom of the hill. Laura, do we want to go on to another question in the chat, or get any other feedback from anybody else on that question?
I think that's good, unless anyone has any specific questions about the rain gardens. Maybe we can move on to another subject. I know Jen has mentioned in the chat the question about examples in addition to the boulders that are at the coming off, that kind of connects the park back to Main Street. And yeah. I think that's something, we certainly have talked about and are thinking about. And Jen, you bring up a great point, as adding something like that, as furthering, creating a unifying element there, I think is a great idea. And it's something that we're thinking about, how to how to make these thresholds, these gateways, special moments. And also, we're thinking about, how, all the different ways that we can make use of the wonderful bluestone that's local to the region. So certainly something that we're excited about exploring further.
Great.
And then I see Chris also has some great suggestions regarding, there's a comment that reads, edge effect of tall grasses and shrubs along the pine area for birds. I think, that's certainly a great suggestion. And then also Chris also has a comment about, interest in seeing a natural fieldstone wall. So Glenn, I don't know if you want to speak, or Sean or Ben, if you want to speak to the wall elements that we have talked about a little bit.
Yeah, I'll start, and you can chime in too, Sean. we are very interested in seeing natural stone walls in the park, and particularly as part of the library garden. And it could extend even, you say, I think 200 to 300 feet long here, which would be wonderful. And it's an element which may express itself again towards that edge where we have the play landscape. We want to really strengthen that idea of the stone kind of tied to the hillside in the way that natural bluestone outcrops are part of the surrounding landscape. That's what we're trying to bring into the park, that these stones feel like they're really tied to the slope and to the hillside. So it could be natural fieldstone, that's a possibility, or it could be bluestone blocks as part of the wall too. We're trying to push the bluestone because that is really the dominant stone in the area, but definitely we're open to other materials as well. So that's an interesting suggestion. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Sean.
Sure, yeah, I'll just add to that. I agree, and Chris, you're probably, as I am, very familiar with a lot of the kind of vernacular agrarian stone walls that you see along the edges of farm fields in the area. It's a really beautiful element that is just so common and a beautiful piece of the heritage of the area. So like Glenn was saying, they could take the form, the bluestone could take the form of some more formal walls up at the overlook and at the library garden, and then start to disintegrate, if you will, into more in between those spaces, into more of a bedrock feeling character, but really still creating that and keeping that link that runs through the park of the bluestone element, and really being a signature for the park. So yeah, agreed on your comment. We're really excited about that as a material. So.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Sarah also has a question about maintenance, which is a great question. Sarah's question is, how about maintenance? This is a lot of gardening, which is, a very good question. So I think, that's something that, I don't know if Glenn, you want to elaborate on.
Sure, and I'd love to have Tina chime in on this too. Yeah, that'd be great to have Tina too. I mean, of course, we're going to be very, we're going to be very cognizant of maintenance because that's key to a successful park. And really, we're keeping the gardens, if you will, to the areas around the library itself. And Tina, you can talk a little bit about the maintenance that you have here, but we will scale them and we would make sure that they are going to be manageable for Tina and her staff over the long run. But we really are keeping the gardens per se to the area just around the library, and they don't have to all go in at once. They could go in sequence until she has enough funding, or the project has enough funding to put them all in and maintain them, because we agree that they have to be there has to be the funding and the staff in place to maintain those gardens. For the rest of the site, we're really envisioning, though I'm calling that a stormwater garden, really it be grasses and native shrubs that require very little maintenance. Once they're established after the establishment period, grasses like that only get mowed down once a year, and the rest of that landscape would be low native shrubs. So we're really designing for as low a maintenance as possible for those stormwater gardens running through the park. And even along the eastern edge of the park, really we see that as native shrubs and grasses and native trees that would require very little maintenance. So it's a great comment, and it is really key to a successful park. So we're thinking about that very carefully. And Tina, I don't know if you want to interject anything about the current maintenance.
I, when we wrote the grant for this, I was able to budget in our annual budget for a seasonal part-time gardener. And I think the only worry I have is, in the first 3 years of anything, there's a lot more work to establish till things get to a certain size. So you'll see me out there. I'll probably be weeding occasionally.
That's great.
Are there any other questions, Laura?
there any questions here? I'm coming through. Does anyone have anything they want to add? I know there's, so Tracy has a question. Thank you, Tracy. Tracy says, I see many older kids and college students that play catch in the upper park. Will there be an area that's large enough for that up in the upper portion of the park? And I think,
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah. And I think, the way we are envisioning that upper portion, we kind of see that as being programmatically somewhat more passive than the lower portion of the park, although it's, not exclusively so. But we are envisioning that, there will be the labyrinth area that would be, flat ground plane essentially, that would be adjacent to the overlook. And I think that, even with the orchard plantings and the pinetum that we're proposing, I believe we still have a fair amount of lawn space there that kind of, affords room for things like playing catch and frisbee and stuff like that. I don't know if you guys want to add anything else.
Yeah. No, I'd agree with that, Laura. Though we've focused the upper part of the park on horticultural collections, we've really pushed them to the sides in order to keep that large central area of the upper part of the park quite open. A lot of it would be lawn underneath the trees, but even where there aren't the trees, really just the center of that space. And as Sean was mentioning early when he was doing the analysis, one of the key views is when you come into the park from the upper part and you look towards the overlook. We want to keep that central part of that upper part of the park open. That vista is really a key part of the identity of the park and really the historic views of the park. So we are going to keep that central part of the upper part of the park quite open.
No, I don't think there are any other questions, but I think I want to remind everyone that if you take the survey, we would very much appreciate it. You can give us a lot more feedback than you have time
Okay,
for.
what else in the chat here?
And yeah, Ben just put it in the chat. So it's a live link. If you can click on the chat, you'll see it and you can open up that window. It'd be great if you did it tonight because it's all fresh in your mind and you've seen this lovely design. And I feel like there are this has been such an ongoing process. And I have to say that there were some parts of this that really jumped out at me. I love the fact that Henry Huntington had an orchard and we're considering an orchard. And if you look at those old images of Huntington Park, Henry Huntington, it's like pine, well, I don't know if they're called pine trees. They're conifers, right? They're all variety of conifers everywhere in this park. And as you know, they don't live as long, so there are not many here anymore. But to be able to honor that memory that he loved, obviously, I think that's going to be a beautiful section that this team came up with. Just shocked me with that. And I know that we were considering a lilac walk, and I wanted to share with you all that there was a house here that was demolished, and the Huntingtons across the street in that little shopping plaza. And Jen told me this. She's a clerk at the library. She's been going through all the Huntington files for me. And she said they lived there while they built this house, and that lilac trees were one of their favorite things. So lilacs are part of the Huntington legacy, and the pinetum and the fruit orchard. And I just love seeing that paired with all these really exciting new areas that are really relevant to today's life. So I appreciate very much what you've done. Please click on the link, folks. I know we've run over time, but I appreciate you hanging in there with us. And we really look forward to hearing from you in the survey. All right, thank you and good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Tina. And actually, one quick question that came up in the chat also. Mike just wanted to, ask, where we can find a copy of the maps and the illustrations. Again, some of that stuff you'll see in the survey. But Tina, do you want to share that again?
Yeah, I mean, right now I have it in the walkway off Main Street, to the parking
Thanks.
garage. the big giant, there's two of them, of the past and of the future, and you can see them there. Do you all mind if I post this presentation on our website? Glenn, would that be okay?
By us?
Nope, that'd be great. That'd be
Okay.
great.
Yeah, it's great.
Okay, so we can make that accessible too.
Okay, terrific. All right, thanks everybody.
All right, thank you, folks.
Everyone.
Thanks. Good night.
Thanks, everyone. We really appreciate it.
Good night.